Hey friend, it's Akil here to talk about relationships. This is probably one of the spiciest topics you can come up with when you're talking about spiritual practice, because there's a lot of myths about relationships in spiritual practice. One of them is that you can't have relationships if you want to pursue a spiritual life. Of course, this is a myth that's passed down through antiquity, and it's a huge part of the culture that we have, but of course, it's not really true. So one of the things that's most valuable about spiritual practice is that it teaches you about how to navigate your relationships skillfully. Everything is a relationship, including your breathing. That's a relationship between elements in the atmosphere and your body, and it's continuously unfolding. And while you can perform practices that help you more skillfully navigate your breathing, you can also do the same thing with your relationships. Part of that is understanding what kinds of relationships support you. And as you engage more deeply with your spiritual practice, you will start to realize that there are some relationships that feed you and some of them that don't. So this is where our boundaries become very important. And what I've noticed in spiritual communities is that boundaries are one of those things that's very difficult to discuss. And so my way of understanding boundaries is that they are the things that help us to feel safe to show up freely as ourselves. And these, of course, are things that change over time because we change over time. But the essence of what helps us to feel safe is that you can feel free to express yourself, that you know that trust is given in the environment that you're in, and that there's a reciprocity there. And that's something that isn't always obvious, especially in our day-to-day lives. Because we have such a hierarchical system set up in so much of our lives, things aren't necessarily reciprocal, and we don't really know that we're actually being nurtured or not. So that's where our mindfulness and spiritual practice becomes super valuable. Because once we attend to what's going on in here, when we know what helps us to feel safe, what helps us to feel seen, what helps us to feel valued, then we understand how to relate to things around us. And that's something that that's information that we can come to through self-exploration. So one of the things that we need to understand is when we don't have a handle over how we're able to show up, when we're not allowing ourselves to show up freely, we can't expect reasonably that other people should make the environment so that we should. And what I mean to say is, like when I was a teenager, I used to think the whole world needs to change so that I can show up as myself because there's something wrong with the world and I need to show up more freely as myself, so the world needs to change, but I'm good. And what I realized later in life is, of course, that's not entirely true. There's a both and in the situation as usual. Both the world makes conditions that make it difficult for people to show up freely, and we also carry around conditioning that makes it difficult for us to show up freely. The things that we do have control over is how we're managing our relationships with our own stuff. So that's what our spiritual practice is really all about. Gradually, as you steep yourself in this path and you start to recognize what helps you to feel more free, and you do practices that help you meet your conditioning and untangle the things that have kept you locked in separateness, you gradually start to develop this kind of compassion that extends naturally outwards. And you see, first of all, everybody's going through the same stuff. Everybody has conditioning, and that the structure of the world has been built upon this misunderstanding. And that when we further misunderstanding by creating more divisions and separateness, first within us and then in our relationships, it makes it really difficult for anybody to feel free. So if the goal of life is to be able to thrive and live a peaceful and prosperous, loving life, we need to be able to recognize the places where we're holding things that make it difficult for us to do that, and where we're placing those expectations on others, and how we're interacting with systems that create more inequity. And this is a process. It's not something that's super obvious. It's something that we gradually have to come to. Everybody is in a different place with their learning. That's where our compassion becomes so valuable. When we practice and cultivate a deep sense of belonging, trust, and compassion, we recognize that everybody, including ourselves, is in a process, and that the best way to support others is to support ourselves first. Take that in and see how it feels.